Okay, we're going to start this whole show again and we're going to try and just record it. Hopefully, you'll hear all the audio, and I will just stick with this main screen since I'm just recording. Alright, so chapter 10 is really all about the sympathetic nervous system antagonists, right? So we're talking about blocking alpha, we're talking about blocking beta. So where I want to start is by showing, starting at the level of the brain, we have, that is a really big neuron. Let's try that again. We have the first neuron in the system. It releases acetylcholine. It is myelinated, and it releases acetylcholine onto a second neuron in the system that activates and releases norepinephrine. Now that norepinephrine can go off and bind to alpha-1, it can bind to beta-1, it can bind to beta-2, or it can feed back and bind to alpha-2 right there. It can move upstream and bind alpha-2 on the presynaptic neurons of the first ganglia as well. I'm sorry, of the first neuron as well. I'm about to sneeze. Hang on. Excuse me. Okay, so question I want to answer before we get into the drugs is what happens when you antagonize each one of these systems, right? So the only effects I'm going to write are what the antagonists do. So let's start with alpha-1. Oh, excuse me. That was a sneeze, not a yawn. And with alpha-1, the main effect that we're really going for is on our blood vessels, where what we see is vasodilation. Sorry, I'm going to sneeze. Hang on. Sorry about that. With vasodilation, we get a decrease in PVR, and ultimately that leads to a decrease in blood pressure. And of course, for the most part, this is actually our goal. This is our therapeutic endpoint that we're going for. So that's going to have a happy sign. In our GI tract, there's also effects, and what we see is an increase in peristalsis. And if you increase peristalsis, the effect generally is increased movement through the GI tract. And usually, most people consider that an adverse effect. At the level of the eye, what you have is decreased pressure. And you also see semiosis. Now, the decreased pressure leads to glaucoma relief. And again, that's generally considered a good thing. In the uterus, what you see is relaxation. Usually not much of an issue, except in late pregnancy. The bladder, you'll get an increase in voiding. And alpha-1 inhibitors are really known for their sexual dysfunction. Where, again, usually that's considered to be an adverse effect. Okay, we're going to moving up to alpha-2. If you were to antagonize alpha-2, you would get a release of acetylcholine release, and you would get a release of an increase of norepinephrine release, and usually those are actually adverse effects, right? Especially the norepinephrine side, because if you're blocking alpha-2, you're getting more norepinephrine release. You're blocking alpha-1, so it's not going over here, but it is going to go everywhere else. We'll come back to that in just a minute. On the beta-2 side, you get primarily what we think of are the effects on the lungs, right? And so you get bronchoconstriction. Usually that is something that we're not incredibly happy about. You also see with beta-1 on the blood vessels, you see vasoconstriction. But in general, that is on skeletal muscle. The uterus, you also see contraction. Most people, not a problem, but late semester pregnancy, you probably don't want to start contractions. And then in the liver, what you get is decrease of glycogenolysis, glycogen genolysis, which means you get less glucose. With less glucose, you get less ATP. And with less ATP, you get a decrease in energy. Okay? And with beta 1, of course, the effects that we really know about are the effects on the heart. You decrease contractility and you decrease heart rate. That is usually our therapeutic goal. You also see in adipose, I don't think it switched colors, adipose, you see a decrease in lipolysis, so you see a decreased breakdown. Not so much that you'll really see an increase in fat deposition, but it will make it a little bit harder to lose weight. And then on the liver side, and we'll come back to the renin system later, you'll get a decrease in renin release. Okay? Okay. So I want to walk us through the baroreceptor reflex. I just need a new page to do that. Okay, so for the baroreceptor reflex, we've got a couple of different parts that we need to draw. Sorry, I have one I've drawn previously, and I want to get over to it. Make sure I draw all the pretty parts. I want to start with the blood vessels in the periphery, right? That feeds over to the central nervous system. And then that's going to have a feedback. You're going to have a ganglia, have a second neuron, and you're going to come back to the heart, right? So here you're going to have blood vessels, and really it's going to be the carotid sinus, the carotid artery. That is going to be felt. It's going to signal into your central nervous system. You're going to have an interneuron. It's going to activate a second neuron, which is going to be your output to your ganglia, okay? So the things I want to point out is that this is a positive effect, meaning when it's activated, it causes an exponential and a release of neurotransmitter to the second neuron. Your second neuron in the line is a negative neurotransmitter. So when this neuron gets activated, it releases a negative neurotransmitter to the next one in line and really shuts off the rest of the system. So when you have high PVR, right, so when you have PVR, it leads to a shutdown of the system, okay? I want to erase that for right now. And talk about the other neurons in the system. This second interneuron in the central nervous system is a positive activator, right? So it will lead to an EPSP, an excitatory postsynaptic potential, in the neuron leaving the central nervous system. That'll activate the neuron leaving the ganglia and lead to an increase in activity on the heart. Okay, the heart, of course, has beta 1. Your blood vessels have alpha 1, and your neurons right here have alpha 2. So I want to put all of those in here as well. So when you have high pressure in the vasculature, you activate this first neuron in the system, you lead to the activation of this stop neuron, and everything else turns off. So high PVR leads to decrease cardiac output. Conversely, low PVR, you don't activate this first neuron, which means you don't turn on this inhibitory neuron. You take your foot off the brakes, and this second neuron is allowed to go. Okay? So when the second neuron goes, what you get, really, this way, is an increase in cardiac output. Right? So an increase in PVR really leads to shunting right here, where a decrease in PVR leads to an increase in cardiac output. Why does that matter? Well, I'm going to use the bottom half of this screen, and let's talk about the alpha inhibitors for a second, then we'll move back up. So on the alpha inhibitor side, you've got our main goal is inhibition of alpha 1, right? This is what we want to inhibit. So goal. But our drugs are not so selective, so sometimes we hit alpha 2. Okay. The drugs that hit just alpha 1 are your Zosyn drugs. Because we're talking about antagonists, I'm going to switch to red, so all of your Zosyns act here. and they're selective, and they really just block alpha 1. And with that, you will see somewhat of a compensatory increase in cardiac output because that's our body's natural response, right? That's what we just walked through above, but not a huge amount. Whereas if we have two different drugs, we've got phentolamine and phenoxybenzamine, they block both alpha 1 and alpha 2. What you get is a dramatic increase in compensatory cardiac output. Okay, so why does that happen? Let's go back to this picture up top. If I am using one of these drugs and so I'm going to pick one of these guys and I'm going to block alpha 1. If I'm blocking alpha 1, I'm decreasing PVR and I'm leading to an increase in cardiac output, right? So more norepinephrine gets released when this happens, right? So blocking alpha 1, one of the main effects is an increase in norepinephrine at the heart level because of the baroreceptor. And that norepinephrine will go and bind to beta 1, right? And normally it will bind to alpha 2. And alpha 2 will cause it to stop. It has a little negative feedback loop. But if my drug is blocking alpha 2, right here, these drugs are blocking alpha 2, then that norepinephrine only has one place to go. It only can go to the heart, and the heart rate goes really, really, really fast, and you get a large increase. Right, so that's why phentolamine and phenoxybenzamine are not nearly as safe, as any of the Zosyn drugs in terms of decreasing PVR. All right, so that is our alpha 1 side. We also want to take a look, at your beta inhibitors, your beta antagonists. And on the beta side, beta 1 is our goal, right? So this is our goal again. If we're talking about beta blockers, our goal is to decrease cardiac output and really go for beta 1. Beta 2, that's always going to be the, oh man, I can't get away from it. You're going to get bronchoconstriction. It's going to have your adverse effects. So we have a set of drugs that are non-cardioselective, non-heart selective, right? And they block both beta 1 and beta 2. And under that, you can have your full antagonist, or you can have your partial. Okay. The difference here, right, if we remember what we're looking at, is if you have a dose and response, a full agonist is going to have an increase in response as the drug increases, right? So this is your full agonist. And an antagonist is just going to keep you at basal level, right? We're not an inverse, we're just a normal antagonist. Right? And so you're going to have the most dramatic effect at lowering cardiac output, which is great, but you're also going to have the most dramatic effect on the lungs. Not so great. And the partial agonists are somewhere in between. Here's your partial. And really what we're seeing here in both cases is that we're getting a decrease in activity. We're seeing a decrease in activation of the beta receptors, beta 1 or beta 2. You will have, with a full antagonist, you will have more heart decrease, but also more bronchoconstriction. Where with a partial agonist, you'll have only moderate, cardiac decrease, but your lungs will be happier. That's your payoff, okay? We also have a set that is just beta 1 blockers, right? These are your cardioselective drugs. And under there, you can also have a full antagonist or a partial agonist. And here the difference is truly how much cardiac output do you decrease. We're no longer worried about the lungs, right? The benefit of the partial agonist in your non-selective beta blockers is the fact that you don't have as much of a lung effect. But with your cardioselective ones, really it's how much cardiac output do you want to decrease, because that's the main difference. And then we have a set that is also non-selective across alphas and betas, right? So here, and we're talking labetalol, carvedilol, I'm going to put beta 1, beta 2, and alpha 1 in here. It would be absolutely beautiful if we could have something that blocked beta 1 and alpha 1, right? Because here you would have decreased cardiac output, and here you would have decreased PVR. That is the definition of an antihypertensive. That's exactly what we want. But of course, that does not exist. You can't have a drug that only blocks those two. So what we have are a set of drugs that block both. They are non-selective beta blockers and an alpha 1 blocker. Okay? And with that, you've got labetalol and carvedilol. Excuse me, my allergies are going a little bit berserk here. Okay, so you've got two drugs that do both, and really those are an advantage over these non-selective just beta blockers. So carvedilol, and labetalol. And the reason they're an advantage is because if you're going to go through the hassle of blocking the beta 2 and bronchoconstricting, you may as well give some relief on PVR. Okay, so that is chapter 10. I'm actually going to do each chapter individually, so I'm going to stop recording.